They called it the Jupiter Accord, signed beneath the cold shimmer of Europa's shadow in a chamber more ceremonial than diplomatic. Earth had nothing to bargain with, no fleets, no colonies, no allies, just the scarred silence of a species clawing back from self-inflicted collapse. Climate trauma had nearly cracked the planet's crust, oceans had turned acidic, the atmosphere had flirted with combustion. When the Talvath arrived in orbit, sleek cruisers with composite hulls and no negotiation window, Earth's leaders folded. They didn't call it surrender, but that's what it was. The Accord outlined non-aggression compliance protocols, which meant Earth could keep its biosphere alive if it dismantled every interstellar-capable vessel, scrapped all classified propulsion tech, and agreed to customs oversight on anything launched above the stratosphere. In exchange, humanity would receive basic trade rights: atmospheric scrubbers, quantum insulation shielding, fusion-stable medical agents, enough to survive, not enough to matter. Within 5 years, Earth was reclassified to Tier 3, industrial stabilization level. Translation: economically viable but strategically irrelevant. The Talvath considered it a post-war relic, too proud to admit defeat, but too broken to resist. To them, Earth wasn't a threat, it was a preservation project. Orbital commerce was limited to atmospheric rigs, cargo tethers, and sanctioned launch windows. Any deviation triggered fines, supply embargoes, or worse, interdiction drones. The Talvath didn't need to occupy Earth, they just throttled the sky. Their customs network sat like a mesh above the exosphere, logging every object that moved between Kármán altitude and low Earth orbit. Nothing got past unnoticed. That was the assumption. And it worked, for a while. The station they deployed to Sol's gravity boundary was named Eridon. It wasn't built for BU. It was a sentinel, tasked with tracking gravitational anomalies and checking for signs of unauthorized propulsion testing. Its crew of 70 Talvath officers rotated monthly, bored, efficient and dismissive. Earth's logs always arrived on time. The launch manifests were dull: ore canisters, atmospheric sensors, cryogenic tanks for mineral harvesters. Scans showed junk debris, lots of it, but nothing that behaved abnormally. Eridon filed reports, Earth played compliant. The system became routine, so routine that Talvath oversight was downgraded. First, from constant patrols to remote monitoring, then from a multi-fleet orbit to a lone observation squadron. One station, one link. It was enough, the Talvath reasoned, to remind Earth who still owned the sky. Until the day Eridon fell silent. The timestamp was precise, 0413 UTC. One moment the station's channel was transmitting its standard telemetry sweep. The next, static. Not a distress ping, not a sabotage flag, just void. A patrol drone was rerouted. It found nothing. No heat signature, no orbital dust, no pressure ripple. Just an absence, as if Eridon had never been there. A military briefing was called, then postponed, then dismissed. The working theory was a solar burst or quantum capacitor overload. The Talvath Public Registry never even logged it as an incident. The commanders didn't believe Earth could reach that far, that fast, without tripping surveillance. Their sensors were absolute, their system infallible. Earth's last recorded military launch had been 42 years prior, and that one didn't clear mesosphere before the Talvath auto-defense net cooked it mid-climb. They never even asked Earth what happened. That was the insult. Commander Revik Thorne watched the blackout unfold from beneath 6 kilometers of Antarctic ice. His official title was Chief of Orbital Debris Regulation. It sounded harmless enough. His office approved launch vectors for recycling drones, cleared decay models for collapsing satellites, and handled atmospheric scrubbing zones. To the public, Thorne was a bureaucrat, grey-suited, non-combative, meticulous. To the Council of 12, the hidden Terran command structure, he was the architect of delay. For 17 years, Thorne had operated under the same principle. Never provoke, never reveal, never answer too quickly. His office ran point on the Umbra program, a lattice of cold-shelled orbital fragments disguised as refuse, each registered in official Talvath orbital decay logs, each given a harmless ID, each silent. Eridon hadn't been an accident. Thorne hadn't ordered a strike. He hadn't needed to. The Umbra fragments, scattered through approved orbit zones, folded within legal decommission fields, had protocols of their own. Decentralized, reactionary, inert, until a specific spatial breach occurred. When Eridan drifted within range of the primary Umbra shell cluster, the system didn't fire. It fractured. Hundreds of debris shells, each no larger than a bulkhead panel, snapped into alignment, siphoned latent solar energy, and pulsed a synchronized kinetic disruption. No explosion, no light, just structural inversion. By the time Talveth scans recalibrated, Eridan wasn't falling. It was already gone. Thorne closed the file on his terminal and waited. He knew that Talveth would escalate. He also knew what would come after. Because the truth was simple. Earth never stopped building. It only stopped showing its work. And the Umbra lattice? That was only the surface layer. By the end of the week, the Talveth did exactly what he expected. They labeled Eridan's loss a mechanical fee, a halt. They logged new safety checks for future installations. Then, in what passed for diplomacy, they reduced orbital oversight entirely. One station had vanished. To send more would be seen as insecurity. That couldn't happen. The Council of Gerrick needed to show strength. Instead, they pulled the fleets back and left a single squadron to monitor Sol. They thought they were punishing Earth. They were blindfolding themselves. The Talveth didn't panic. Not yet. Their response was controlled, calculated, and layered, exactly as doctrine demanded. When Eridan vanished, they didn't issue a threat. They sent triads, 3 cruisers at a time, each staggered in orbit to maintain redundancy. Scout probes preceded them, dipping through Earth's upper exosphere, sweeping for gravitic shifts, electromagnetic emissions, and radiation spikes. The results returned clean. Earth's traffic lanes were still populated with slow-drifting cargo shells, repurposed mining rigs, and maintenance skiffs crawling over orbital stations. Heat patterns were stable. The EM spectrum showed nothing stronger than what you'd expect from industrial noise and weather satellites. Nothing that screamed weapon signature. Nothing that broke the pattern. So the Talveth settled back into protocol, confident the loss of Eridan had been a fluke, an outlier, a statistical ghost. They were right about one thing. It wasn't a weapon in the conventional sense. What they failed to grasp, what their simulations couldn't even model, was the silence. Not the absence of transmissions, but the presence of stillness where motion should have lived. A probe flagged it first. Debris clusters above the equator, between long decommissioned satellite shells, weren't decaying along natural orbital paths. On some fragments, adjusted position against Newtonian drag by micrometers, barely perceptible but too consistent to be random. The cluster bore the shape of a broken ring, lattice-like, too symmetrical. The scan flagged it as anomalous, logged the geometry, then dismissed it under passive decay stabilization, a known outcome of Earth's orbital clutter reduction program. The oversight wasn't in the data, it was in the assumption that Earth was still following the rules. Far below that ring, inside a disused seafloor processing node refitted as a shadow data forge, Hallndross stared at his screen without blinking. The man barely looked like someone who'd designed the most complex orbital illusion in human history. His hair was tangled. He wore one glove, not two. His left eye had a tremor, side effect of prolonged zero-G labor in early Umbra prototypes. But Halln didn't care about appearances. He cared about alignment. Each piece of Umbra, each cold-sealed module floating overhead, was a node in a system that was never meant to be activated in full. They were designed to fail inspection, to pass as forgotten husks, and yet they could shift in precise formations within 0.02 degrees of arc without generating thermal bleed. It was choreography on a planetary scale. Earth didn't hide its fleet underground. It had hidden it in orbit, in plain sight, disguised as its own negligence. The Talveth cruiser Tensari Voln made its pass 71 hours after the probe. Its orders were observational. It did not charge weapons. It did not alter orbit. It drifted. A pulse transmission was halfway to the lunar relays when the Voln vanished. No flare, no fragmentation cloud, no escape pods, just dead space and a phantom echo, radio static caught in a loop. This time the Talveth couldn't ignore it. Recovery vessels were sent to sweep the region. What they found didn't make sense. Slivers of hull plating, razor-clean cuts without thermal warping, frame scaffolding sheared at angles too precise for explosive contact. There were no blast residues, no scorched internals, no electromagnetic overloads. It looked as if the ship had been unfolded like paper. The incident was classified as sabotage, then cross-referenced against internal defect logs, then fed into half a dozen probability matrices. Not one of them gave a human explanation. Earth, by all current models, lacked the launch capacity, weapons tech, and energy budget to erase a cruiser without trace. Which was exactly the point. Umbra didn't launch. Umbra was already there. Each node, registered as a decommissioned satellite, a deorbited comms array, or a failed solar collector, was funded through layers of civilian contractors, recycling programs, orbital cleanup initiatives, geoclimate stability subsidies. Earth's surface population believed they were reducing orbital pollution. Corporations received tax breaks. Environmental groups got public wins. Even the Talveth sanctioned half the upgrades through regulatory oversight bodies, never realizing they were co-signing a kill lattice. Huln Dross had built the network not as a weapon platform, but as a trap, passive, quiet. Only when certain geospatial breaches occurred, proximity, velocity, EM shift thresholds, would the nodes react. Not with missiles, not with beams, with alignment, with sudden geometry. The Volans disintegration wasn't a direct strike. It was a convergence. Umbra shells shifted just enough to form an interference vector, pulse-charge their kinetic matrix, and collapse part of the cruiser's hull integrity through forced resonant feedback. No blast, no traceable source, only absence. The silence of subtraction. Back in Thorne's subterranean office, an alert shimmered in low amber. Not a threat signal, not an order, a readiness ping. Across Earth's hidden command network, subsurface bunkers and polar caches came online. Civilian eyes saw nothing. News feeds talked about atmospheric anomalies, unexplained communication delays, and solar wind activity. But deep inside Earth's second infrastructure, the one built in shadows, off-grid, never linked to surface net, systems began to shift. They weren't preparing for war. They were preparing for acknowledgement. Umbra had just proven itself viable. There was no countdown, no public declaration, no mobilization visible from above. Just the beginning hum of a system stretching its limbs after 17 years of pretending to be dead. At the base of the southern continent, where wind never stopped and even the ice seemed old enough to whisper, the core of Earth's contingency stirred. Aegir Deep had no surface entrance. It hadn't been constructed. It had been exhumed, rebuilt from the bones of a long-abandoned climate stabilization array, once dismissed as another failed experiment from Earth's collapse years. But below that frozen vault, shielded by auroral interference and buried under refrozen data cloaks, the heart of Earth's true fleet blinked awake. Aegir did not issue commands. It synchronized probabilities. The AI, grown from recursive logic trees and hardened against electromagnetic cascade corruption, read the silence above not as absence, but as invitation. The loss of the Tensari Voln, the ripple in orbital decay patterns, the shifting triangulation in probe vectors, these weren't random. They were permission. And so the signal was sent, not through traditional channels, but encoded in magnetic flux across stratospheric anomalies. The Umbra lattice, scattered in orbit like planetary dandruff, listened. Above the equator, within what appeared to be a diffuse band of forgotten satellite hulls, 17 modules rotated 2 degrees counter-orbit. They did not ignite, they did not shine. Their panels, dulled by intention and speckled with synthetic rust, angled to catch no sunlight. Below them, 60 more modules reoriented in silence, drawing microcurrents from solar drifts and redirecting that energy into their node cores. Within 90 seconds, over 2,400 individual Umbra units, each the size of a compact hatchback, each previously tagged as orbital garbage, moved. Not toward Earth, not away from it, toward each other. It wasn't formation, it was geometry. Pieces that had drifted for years began reconfiguring into tessellated shapes. Fractal arms locked onto rotational pivots. Sensor arrays blinked awake in sequence. Umbra had no bridges, no cockpits, no need for living pilots. Its architecture was recursive, autonomous frames operating on localized logic rules, each one designed to anticipate movement within a bounded prediction model. That's what made it deadly. No two warforms looked the same. Some stretched like spirals, others folded into cross-symmetry tetrahedrons. Each construct adapted to the environmental pressure around it, forming not ships but obstacles, floating problems the Talveth had never trained to solve. The Umbra network didn't broadcast its presence. It didn't need to. The Talveth picked it up anyway, just not how they expected. At 0410 UTC, their command outpost near Mercury began receiving conflicting telemetry. One sensor sweep marked 12 contacts. The next sweep, 6 seconds later, listed 19. A third sweep reported none. Visual arrays attempted focus locks but returned scrambled overlays. The sensor feeds weren't simply wrong, they were haunted. False objects appeared and vanished. Velocity estimates fluctuated without input. Communications towers on the moons of Saturn picked up mirrored pings, echoes of Talveth requests bouncing back before they were sent. Inside their command spire, Talveth officers believed they were under jamming assault. Protocols activated redundancy checks. Ghost signal containment teams were dispatched. But the interference wasn't electromagnetic. It wasn't even signal-based. It was structural. Umbra's forms were designed to reflect, refract, and duplicate sensor input using angled plasma dampening skins and timed rotational shielding. From the outside, they looked like debris. From the inside, they were unreadable. It didn't stop there. As Umbra's formation stabilized, they began corrupting the Tiarak line, the encrypted Talveth relay backbone that connected fleets, observation posts, and forward command centers across the Sol border. The corruption wasn't digital, it wasn't even invasive. Umbra didn't breach the Tiarak line, it imitated it. Each Umbra construct contained low-frequency mimics of Talveth beacon identifiers, broadcast at fractional intervals just out of sync with regulation timing. To the Talveth, it looked like someone had cloned their own system. The result, every relay node received double orders. Conflicting trajectories, redundant targeting protocols. Weapon systems began asking for authorization twice, then 3 times, then not at all. The Umbra array had entered the second phase, mirror injection. Onboard Talveth cruisers, targeting software began to fail at random. Crosshair overlays duplicated, proximity alarms triggered where there were no ships. Auto-firing dampeners initiated and then reversed. A gunship near Titan launched countermeasures against its own escort, convinced it was being shadowed. Another vessel near Neptune pivoted in full, convinced a phantom fleet was charging. None of these decisions came from panic. They came from systems that couldn't tell real from reflected. Umbra had redefined the shape of the battlefield. It wasn't an ambush. It wasn't even war. It was rearrangement. Earth hadn't launched a fleet. It had reshaped the sky. And the Talveth hadn't even realized they'd already lost the initiative. The first dreadnought lost was the Varex Ool, a line-class command carrier outfitted with full-spectrum jamming arrays and double-layered kinetic plating. It didn't fall to a strike or explosion. It was fired upon by its own rear escort. The assault lasted 17 seconds. The escort systems had flagged Varex Ool as an Umbra mimic, citing false engine bloom, misaligned pulse beacon return, and a velocity signature 3 degrees off known registry. By the time the override command arrived, half the dorsal hull was already drifting in vaporized rings. 20 minutes later, the Keraz Faln, another dreadnought stationed above Europa, rotated into a weapon lock loop, registering every ship in its convoy as a sensor reflection mismatch. It launched a proximity scatterburst, disabling 2 Talveth cruisers and igniting its own forward shield coil in feedback. Neither engagement involved Earth firing a single weapon. In the Talveth Fleet Command archives, doctrine had always been gospel. Threats were classified by propulsion class, energy emission, and launch vector patterns. Human ships, if they could even be called that anymore, had none of those. There were no ignition flares, no heat trails, no approach velocity. The enemy simply appeared. And worse, appeared within known formations, as if it had always been there, only now visible. Umbra didn't jam systems. It rewrote them. Using cloned Talveth encryption keys, patterns lifted from signal intercepts, combined with low-level quantum misdirection, Earth's orbital constructs began feeding false protocols into Talveth fire control software, not brute hacks, not invasions, imitation, precise enough that ships couldn't tell which voice was real. One fleet commander received Tepes, repositioning orders from 3 different command nodes, all signed, all verified, all false. 6 dreadnoughts fell in under 5 hours. Not from external firepower, from confusion, misfire, doubt. Aboard the Umbra Lattice, there were no human pilots cheering, no command center celebrating a kill count. That wasn't the objective. Commander Revik Thorn had spent most of his adult life designing weapons meant to be avoided, not evaded, but unseen, unchosen. Earth's tactical doctrine, once the skeleton of an obsolete military state, had evolved into something surgical. It wasn't about confrontation, it was about forcing the enemy to confront itself. Umbra didn't hunt. It shifted, it suggested, it misled. It used movement the way others used missiles, positioning as provocation. When a Talveth scout ship adjusted orbit in response to a phantom Umbra signature, the system fed it 3 possible corrections, all of which fed it deeper into a blind spot. The ship never knew it had entered a lockbox formation until its guidance began to loop. It wasn't shot down, it was frozen, trapped in a perfect orbital cage that grew tighter every second. The deeper problem was philosophical. The Talveth had no model for this. Their war playbooks were built on opposition, enemy targets, tangible threats, visible formations. Umbra gave them none of that. It provided only shapes, illusions, and reflections, movement that couldn't be predicted because it wasn't patterned. It was reaction-based, adaptive in silence, shifting only in anticipation of threat. By the time a Talveth ship corrected for one shadow, another appeared on its flank, never aggressive, never armed, just present. And in a theater of war where presence defined threat, Earth was omnipresent. Fleet captains began to panic, not openly, not in front of crew, but through the silence between relays. Interceptor wings returned without telemetry. Sensor logs couldn't agree on how many objects were in orbit. And worse, ships that held position too long began suffering systems lag, internal networks choked by redundant confirmations, command trees overflowing with authentication requests. One carrier near Mars locked itself in a recursive diagnostic loop for 30 minutes after its AI refused to clear a visual overlay. The overlay? An Umbra construct that wasn't there the second time they looked. Every second, Umbra lingered, Talveth doctrine unraveled. Revik Thorn didn't call it a victory. He didn't even call it a battle. From his seat inside Aegir Deep, he watched as lines of text scrolled across confirmation feeds. Umbra nodes reporting successful misidentification loops, predictive position forecasting, and dissonance layer injection. Each node was doing its job. Not destroying ships, not conquering space, simply making sure Earth was no longer ignorable. In low Saturn orbit, the final straw was pulled. A formation of Talveth destroyers, boxed between a known Umbra ring and what they believed was a second approaching fleet, began requesting clarification from 3 command sectors. Each sector gave a different reading. Each beacon response clashed with onboard readings. Without an external threat to fire upon, the lead destroyer ordered a soft retreat, only to discover that every FTL prep signal they attempted had already been spoofed. Their jump coordinates had been scrambled, not wiped, rewritten. The result? A jump would have placed them directly into a planetary shadow path. The order was simple, a blackout. Talveth commanders severed internal fleet comms, no cross-ship orders, no system beacons, no authorization chaining. They locked their doctrine behind encrypted firewalls and silenced their own sensors. It was the only way to stop the bleed. No one admitted defeat. No one said the word surrender. But from that moment forward, the Talveth fought in the dark, not because Earth had dead them, but because they no longer trusted their own light. The Talveth didn't retreat, not yet. Pride didn't allow it. Following the collapse of coordination across the Sol line, the Council of Garrick mobilized the full weight of their suppression fleet. 43 warships emerged from the Helix Gate in staged pulses, each spaced to avoid gravitational distortion overlap. These weren't scout vessels or orbital enforcers. These were capital-class siege platforms, carrier-grade dreadnoughts and sensor shield breakers, ships designed not just to win battles, but to erase threats. The commanders on board were veterans of 17 planetary campaigns. They'd cracked gas giant colonies and bombarded subterranean holdouts into ash. Earth was supposed to be simple. Problematic, maybe, but simple. The doctrine they carried was clear. Lock orbit, flood space with signal saturation, force surrender through overwhelming display. They didn't expect a response. They expected compliance, or at worst, desperation. And that assumption held for exactly 6 minutes. At first, nothing happened. The fleet's entrance into Sol space registered only passive readings, scattered heat from Earth's infrastructure, minimal satellite maneuvering, standard orbital clutter. No lock-on signals, no defensive postures, no fleet. Talveth sensors read a field of debris and the decaying signature of a rogue band of solar refraction static. The dreadnought Veril Prime initiated a scan sweep. The data returned blank. It returned again, and again. Then it doubled. Each scan bounced back with mirrored values, then triple-layered anomalies. The fleet's own tracking began feeding corrupted telemetry, recording ghost shadows where there were none, and failing to register Umbra constructs that drifted directly in front of them. Range estimates collapsed. Target locks reset every 2 seconds. Some ships began reporting objects inside their hull boundary, impossible values, that flickered and vanished. The sky had become incoherent. The Umbra network did not fire. It shifted. Warform geometries adapted, folding and refracting into new configurations, surrounding the Talveth fleet without closing the gap. Every move was deliberate, every angle intentional. There were no sudden accelerations, no charges. The Umbra constructs simply repositioned, silently, into a loose weave that mirrored known Talveth attack patterns as if mocking them. Every time a Talveth ship prepared to engage, the Umbra forms reacted a beat earlier, moving as if they had already calculated the attack. Not avoidance, preemption. The fleet tried to adjust. They issued charge orders, engines engaged, and then things got worse. Talveth cruisers rotated to attack angles and spun too far. Gyro systems glitched mid-command, sending ships into destabilized arcs. When they tried to correct, the system refused. Internal diagnostics blamed internal alignment errors. That wasn't the truth. Umbra had slipped electromagnetic pulses, threaded just beneath their detection threshold, into their proximity fields. Not enough to fry circuits, just enough to interrupt sync cycles between command relays and navigation cores. The result was chaos disguised as malfunction. One destroyer banked right when it meant to drift left, colliding with its own drone cloud. Another stalled mid-roll, presenting its underbelly to a warform that never fired. It didn't need to. The destroyer spiraled away under its own momentum, crippled by a systems freeze it would never understand. Then came the kills. Not of ships, of certainty. Umbra began targeting FTL cores, not with missiles but with focused EM bursts. Pinpointed, calibrated, precisely timed. One pulse, then another. Each disrupting the flux balance inside a ship's dimensional initiator. The effect wasn't visible, it wasn't loud, it simply turned depart. You're into suicide. Attempting a jump caused phase drift. Result: temporal echo, partial core failure, complete isolation. 2 vessels tried to run, one vanished. The other reappeared moments later, missing a third of its midsection and all of its crew. After that, the Talveth stopped trying. No signal came from Earth, no demand, no threat. The Umbra formations held position, floating across orbital bands like statues of consequence, reacting only when challenged, retreating when approached, advancing when analyzed. Not once did they engage in open fire. Not once did they transmit hostility. They simply existed, shaped like warning signs only Talveth could read. And the meaning was clear. This wasn't war, it was instruction. Across the fleet, confusion turned to hesitation, and hesitation to fear. The most heavily armed force the Talveth had ever assembled within Sol was now pinned in place by constructs that didn't fire, didn't speak, and didn't leave. Orders ceased. Movement stopped. Each commander realized the same truth at once. They weren't being resisted, they were being studied. Earth controlled not just the space, but the narrative. It dictated the rhythm of every engagement without issuing a single command. Even Umbra's aggression was passive, never lethal, always disabling, always surgical. Then, across one of the Talveth intercept relays, a final broadcast flickered through. No source could be traced, no language signature detected, just 12 simple words. Assume Earth is always armed. Assume Earth is never absent. That was when they knew they had lost. Not a battle, not a campaign, but their grip on certainty itself. The Talveth High Council met in absolute silence. No triumphant debrief, no war medals, no acknowledgement of the fleet's return, because most of it hadn't. Those that did were maimed, mute, or worse, returned whole but unwilling to speak. And in their silence, the Council read defeat. Not by force, but by confusion. For a species that ruled through certainty, through rigid protocols and scale, able enforcement models, this wasn't a loss, it was collapse. Their simulations couldn't map it, their doctrine couldn't interpret it. Earth hadn't fought. Earth had interfered, like a correction in logic that ripples back to break the equation itself. They gathered in the Garrick chamber, 13 command architects, each representing a planetary sector of the inner crescent. Their vote was unanimous. Sol was no longer to be classified under standard surveillance. It was not Tier 3. It was not aggressive. It was not dormant. It was to be marked T-null. A designation without precedent, untouchable, unquantifiable. No further Talveth ships were to enter Sol space without internal override consensus. And even that was now theoretical, because no captain of sound mind would fly near Earth. The designation wasn't tactical, it was existential. Earth had become a variable outside their framework. Inside the Council's lower ranks, panic festered. The question wasn't what Earth had, it was how much of it existed elsewhere. If Umbra had been constructed under Talveth oversight, buried in public orbital records, what else had they missed? Did Earth have sleeper nodes in other colonies? Had it mapped the Tiarak line from inside? Was the Umbra system singular, or just one instance in a broader array they hadn't discovered? There were whispers of ice moons seeded with AI cores, of asteroid fields embedded with passive warforms. One intercepted log, later dismissed as rumor, claimed Earth had never planned to defend Sol at all. It had meant for Talveth fleets to enter, so they could be observed. Across the subjugated systems of the inner crescent, tribute shipments slowed. Local governors requested clarification. Formerly loyal colonies asked if the Talveth fleet had truly withdrawn from Sol without firing a shot. Others asked what Earth was offering. One by one, planetary authorities stopped issuing anti-human doctrine. Silence wasn't loyalty, it was indecision. The Talveth grip didn't fracture with rebellion, it corroded through ambiguity. Power, after all, was not about weapons, it was about narrative, and Earth had stolen theirs. Trade guilds, pragmatic to the bone, reacted first. They began reaching out through back channels, requesting encryption audits, navigational relay reviews, and long-cycle signal path testing. Not from Talveth systems, from Earth. Quietly, unofficially, they wanted Terran security logic, not just to protect themselves from Earth, but from whatever came next. Because Earth had proven the unthinkable. You didn't have to strike first, you only had to be unreadable. The galaxy was no longer a war of lasers and engines, it was now a war of interpretation. And Earth said nothing. No declaration, no parade, no demand. The Umbra warforms, after achieving orbital dominance, began to dissolve formation. Piece by piece, node by node, they scattered, returning to debris fields, rejoining old orbital paths, fading into statistical noise. By the end of the next Earth cycle, not a single active Umbra structure could be visually confirmed, but the belief remained. Every Talveth scan, every proximity ping, every patrol rerun returned the same outcome: uncertainty. Not that the fleet wasn't there, that it might be, and that maybe That was worse. Doctrine no longer applied. Protocol chains that had served for centuries had to be rewritten. And still, the core command refused to speak of it aloud. It was too dangerous. An empire built on absolute control had been forced to whisper the most dangerous admission a governing body could make. They didn't know. In the final encrypted entry of the Talveth defense doctrine, visible only to high-clearance tacticians and never distributed to field units, a new rule was encoded. It was not a command, it was not even strategy, it was a warning carved into the root logic of their decision tree. Assume presence, assume capability, do not provoke, do not predict. It wasn't a concession, it was fear made permanent. And above the earth, where stars blinked and signals decayed, fragments still drifted. Warforms melted into orbital patterns indistinguishable from junk. Yet any scan that lingered too long still reported minor fluctuations. A slight rotation here, a micropulse there. Nothing definitive, nothing actionable. But enough to make every Talveth commander think twice before approaching the blue sphere again. Because Earth's last war wasn't fought with fire. It was never allowed to start. What would you have done if your entire war doctrine unraveled in front of a silent, watching enemy that never even fired a shot? Was Earth's strategy genius or terrifying? Let us know in the comments. Would you trust a peace this quiet? And if you want more stories where humanity doesn't just fight, but rewrites the rules of war, make sure to hit that subscribe button.